issues. So next we're going to have a representative from the agencies that service our children, and I would like to introduce to you the Executive Director of Niagara Child and Youth Services, Mr. Ellis Katsof.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you everyone for being out here today. This is really what we need, and hopefully from years to come, your numbers are going to grow exponentially. Simon and Valerie both talked about the tipping point, that we're getting close to a point where mental health will be not connected to any type of stigma. It's a great example that Simon, Valerie, and I did not speak to each other or see each other until this morning, and yet we're all saying the same thing. A perfect example that we are close to that tipping point. I want to talk to you also about stigma today. And I want to suggest 3 things that we all have to do to overcome that stigma. We've all been programmed through generations and generations to think of one thing when somebody mentions mental health or mental illness. That is, quote, crazy people. We've seen movies, books, TV shows forever and ever about mental illness related to bizarre, eccentric behaviors. But that's not the reality. I was shopping for some clothes last week, and the salesperson was a retired teacher, and I mentioned to her that I wanted to buy some clothes for a fundraiser that I was going to. She asked what it was about, and I said it was about children's mental health. And she said, wow, as a teacher, I dealt with so many kids that had mental health problems. I figured, oh, wonderful, here's an advocate. Then she went on to tell me about this young boy who used to burn cats. Yes, he did have a mental health problem, but he wasn't representative of the majority of kids that have mental health problems. That was such a great example for me of the stigma that we're still challenged with. The facts are 85% of kids with mental health illnesses have challenges with anxiety that they just don't have the coping skills to deal with depression, with attention deficit disorder, with conduct disorder, not with extreme behaviors that we see movies about. The highest mental illness prevalence among adults is anxiety and depression. If we look around at all of these office buildings behind you, there are thousands of adults in there, and 1 in 5 of them have a mental health challenge in their lives, but they're functioning well. They're holding down jobs. Every time I'm in the media and I talk about mental health, I get a call, either from a principal in the community, a doctor, a lawyer, a politician, sharing with me their personal stories about their own personal mental health challenges. Not extreme behaviors, everyday challenges that we all have, except they don't have the coping skills to deal with them, and they had to learn how to deal with them more effectively. We know it's easier to treat mental illness when the symptoms first show up among kids. But because of the stigma and a lack of services, a lot of parents don't reach out and find help for their children. The stigma has made parents and many adults themselves live with deep, dark secrets. They live in closets, afraid to come out publicly and talk about it. They're afraid of losing friends. They're afraid of losing their jobs. They're afraid of their children having difficulty in the future if they have a stigma of mental health attached to them. And that's just unfair. The reality is having a mental illness, just like Simon was saying, is the same thing as having cancer, diabetes, or heart disease, except for the stigma. You know, 40 years ago when my mom was first diagnosed with breast cancer and had a major mastectomy and had 1 breast removed, we were all afraid to talk about it. My friends asked me if it was contagious. It was amazing. I mean, she went into a depression, and then she had enough of this and started up a recovery group in Montreal and got everybody to reach out. We are now at the tipping point that cancer was many years ago. Fortunately for men, about 10 years ago, we had a breakthrough around prostate cancer, but we still haven't had that breakthrough with mental illness, and we need to see it. Cancer came out of the closet years ago. Now they raise millions of dollars for research, for early identification and early treatment, and we've seen the incredible increase in the cure rate. The same thing has to happen with mental health and mental illness. 1 in 5 kids have mental illness, and only 25% of them only 25% get help. Imagine, 1 in 10 Canadians today have diabetes. Almost 1 in 9 women will get breast cancer. Double the numbers. 1 in 5 kids and adults have mental health problems, and we don't have the funding to do proper research. We don't have the funding to provide proper treatment. The reason? I believe it's stigma. Not because politicians don't want to spend money on mental illness, but because there isn't enough of a critical mass of people demanding it. When we start having enough people speaking out about mental illness, the dollars will come. We need to create a climate where everybody is comfortable speaking about mental illness. 25 years ago, my grandmother took her own life. She lost a child when the child was 10 years old in a drowning accident, and I couldn't understand why she committed suicide. And I asked my father and my uncles and my grandfather, and for the first time in 40 years, they talked about a chronic depression that she had lived with. And this wasn't the first time she attempted suicide. We were always told that she was in the hospital because of a heart problem. I found out after the fact she had one of the strongest hearts of anyone her own age. But they hid it from us. When I was in my 20s, my best friend was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he had a battle of 5 years of fighting that illness. I was one of the few people other than his immediate family that knew that he had it. He refused to tell anybody. All of his friends would have reached out and wrapped themselves around him, but he was afraid, he was embarrassed, he was afraid of what would happen, and he didn't talk out about it. It came to such a point where his only way out for him was to take his life. We have to stop that from happening. We have to look around at all of these buildings around us, all of our families, and we have to tell everybody, you need to speak out. When we start speaking out, we'll have the political clout that will turn our voices into dollars for proper research and proper mental health services. I ask you today to take a message back with yourselves after today. There are 3 things I think we all need to do. 1, we need to get everybody, including our leaders, including our business leaders, our politicians, talking about mental illness. If 1 in 5 have a mental illness, that means every one of us have friends, loved ones, colleagues that have a mental health problem in their lives. We need to admit that publicly, and everyone needs to talk about it. Today, when you go to visit the politicians, some of you, I ask them to start blowing the lid off the stigma around mental illness by talking about it. Second, we need as a community to go out and raise millions of dollars for research into children's mental health. Valerie and Simon both talked about the incidence of children's mental health. 70 to 80% of adults started having problems as youth. We need to do research on children's mental health, not only adult mental health. Most of the dollars today is spent on adult mental health. But the more important fact is, as a community, when we raise dollars for children's mental health, government dollars will follow for research as well. They'll start matching our dollars. They'll see that it's important to the community, and they'll step up to the plate. And third, instead of only demanding dollars for mental health services, I've been in this business for 30 years now. As Simon said, it doesn't matter what political party is in power. I don't believe they don't feel for people with mental health, but they're pragmatic. They have a business to do. And that is spending the few tax dollars they have amongst the greatest pressure points that they have, because that's what gets them reelected. What we need to do when you go in and speak to them today is you have to ask them, what has to happen in the community for them to start moving dollars into mental health? And when you make a list of those things, and you have to go back to your own communities, and you have to start making that happen. Because when we start delivering to them the answers to those questions, which basically are people talking about mental illness, saying that it is a problem in our community, and when it's a voice as loud as the cancer voice, the diabetes voice, the heart and stroke disease voice, when we have a loud voice like that, I guarantee you our politicians will listen, and we'll get the dollars that we need for mental illness treatment. Thank you.